The story of how Cornelius built his palace actually begins a decade before construction, with an act of patient, expensive determination. In 1879, Cornelius purchased a lot at the corner of Fifth Avenue and West 57th Street. The address would be 1 West 57th Street, the northwest corner of what was rapidly becoming the most prestigious residential street in America. Fifth Avenue in the 1870s and 80s was transforming. New York's old money was moving north, away from the cramped streets of Lower Manhattan. Brownstone row houses were giving way to larger, more impressive residences. And 57th Street, then the northern frontier of elite settlement, was prime territory. But here's where it gets interesting. Cornelius didn't just buy one lot. Over the next decade, he systematically acquired 5 adjoining brownstone houses, extending north to 58th Street. One by one, as they became available, he bought them out. Harper's Weekly noted in 1882 that these acquisitions were costly, and that's an understatement. This wasn't just expensive because of the properties themselves. It was expensive because existing owners knew exactly who was buying. When Cornelius Vanderbilt comes knocking, asking to purchase your home because he needs your land for his mansion, the price goes up. By the late 1880s, he owned the entire block front, a full city block on Fifth Avenue, one of the rarest and most valuable parcels of land in New York. To put this in perspective, most wealthy New Yorkers had townhouses. Large, impressive, but still townhouses. One building on one lot, however grand. Cornelius was assembling real estate for something unprecedented. Not a house, an estate, in the middle of Manhattan. In 1883, Cornelius hired architect George B. Post to design a large brownstone château-style house on his new property. It was impressive, by any normal standard, a mansion. But within a decade it wasn't enough. Because this was the Gilded Age, and this was Fifth Avenue, and there was an informal but very real competition happening among America's wealthiest families. Who could build the most impressive house? Whose residence would be the residence? The Astors had their fortress-like mansion. The Goulds were building. Other Vanderbilts, Cornelius's cousins and relatives, were constructing their own palaces up and down Fifth Avenue and in Newport. Cornelius looked at his 1883 house and made a decision. He was going to rebuild. Bigger. Far bigger. He brought George B. Post back, but this time he added someone special. Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was America's preeminent architect for the ultra-wealthy. He'd designed the base of the Statue of Liberty. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He was, by the 1890s, the architect, if you wanted to make an architectural statement. Together, Post and Hunt designed something extraordinary. The model was French Renaissance, specifically inspired by the Château de Blois in France's Loire Valley. This wasn't going to be a brownstone. This was going to be a limestone château that looked like it had been transplanted from the French countryside into the heart of Manhattan. The interior designers? Jules Allard and Sons, the elite Parisian firm that decorated European palaces. They would import paneling, ceilings, furnishings, whole rooms essentially from France. This wasn't just construction. This was an international operation, pulling the finest materials and craftsmen from around the world to one city block in New York. On March 1st, 1892, demolition began. Cornelius razed the brownstones he'd spent years acquiring. The 1883 house was dramatically expanded. and something impossible started rising from the Manhattan bedrock. The project would employ 600 workers. It would run 24 hours a day in shifts, with electric arc lights illuminating the site at night, a marvel in itself. And it would take 18 months. 18 months to build the largest private residence in America. The cost? Approximately $3 million. In 1893, to put that in modern terms, roughly $100 million for a house. Not a hotel, not an apartment building, not a museum. A house. For one family. When the New York Times saw the finished product in late 1893, they called it the finest private residence in America. A palace. They weren't exaggerating. Imagine standing on Fifth Avenue in 1892, watching this thing take shape. First, the sheer size. The mansion occupied the entire block from 57th to 58th Street along Fifth Avenue. In a city where even wealthy families lived in narrow townhouses, this was breathtaking. It was horizontal grandeur in a vertical city. 6 stories tall, plus a basement level, constructed of Indiana limestone, not brownstone like most New York buildings, but pure white stone that would catch the sunlight and glow. The style was French Renaissance château, turrets, steep slate roofs, dormer windows, intricate carvings. It looked like something François I might have built in the Loire Valley, not something that should exist on a Manhattan street corner. The footprint alone was staggering. Contemporary sources vary slightly, but the consensus is that the mansion contained between 130 and 137 rooms. Let me say that again, 137 rooms in a single-family home. 37 principal bedrooms for family and guests, 16 bathrooms, which in the 1890s was almost unimaginable luxury, plus dozens of servants' rooms in the upper floors and basement. But it's not just about counting rooms. It's about what those rooms were. Its entrance was through a porte cochere on 58th Street, a covered driveway where carriages could pull up protected from weather. Guests would step out and enter a 5-story entrance hall. 5 stories. The main hall soared upward through the heart of the house, lined with carved stone imported from France, modelled after galleries in Loire Valley Château. Walking into that entrance hall must have felt like walking into a cathedral. The ballroom occupied 2 full stories and could accommodate 1,000 guests. 1,000 people. At a private party. In someone's house. The ceiling had been painted in Paris by artist Edouard Toudouse over the course of a year, then carefully shipped to New York and installed. But here's what makes this house truly remarkable. It's not just the scale. It's the details. Every single detail, chosen and crafted with obsessive precision. The entrance hall featured an enormous fireplace designed by Augustus St. Gaudens, one of America's greatest sculptors. This wasn't just a fireplace. It was an 11 by 15-foot marble masterpiece, flanked by carved caryatids, female figures serving as supporting columns. In the centre, a mosaic with a Latin inscription that Cornelius himself had composed, welcoming guests in classical language. That fireplace survives today, by the way. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you can still see it. But imagine it in its original setting, dominating that soaring entrance hall. The grand staircase rose through the centre of the house, topped by an innovative stained glass dome created by John Lafarge. Not just any stained glass, but an artistic masterpiece using new techniques for multicolored glass that Lafarge had pioneered. Sunlight would filter down through that dome, casting rainbow patterns across the marble stairs. Every major room had a different historical style. There was a Louis XIV salon, a Louis XVI drawing room, a Moorish smoking room, and this is worth describing. The smoking room was 2 stories tall, decorated in Islamic-inspired mosaics and geometric patterns with elaborate stained glass. It was like walking into the Alhambra, in New York, in someone's house. The formal dining room doubled as an art gallery. Walls finished in hand-tooled leather, silk damask panels, gilt wood panelling, and rare carved wood from European forests. The conservatory, a glass-enclosed garden room filled with exotic plants. The library, a private theatre, multiple parlours, each decorated to rival European palaces. And then there was the art collection. Cornelius and Alice filled their home with paintings by old masters, Turner, Lely, Constable. Some rooms were literally built around the paintings, galleries designed specifically to display and honour the art. The contemporary critics wrote that the mansion would command admiration in any land of palaces. They meant it. This could have stood next to Versailles and held its own.
But here's what's fascinating. Despite all the old-world aesthetics, this was a cutting-edge, modern house. The Vanderbilt Mansion had its own electric generator. In the 1890s, most of New York still used gas lighting. The Vanderbilts had electric lights throughout, one of the first private homes in the city to be fully electrified. Remember how I mentioned the construction ran 24 hours a day under electric arc lights? Cornelius was so committed to this technology that he powered the construction itself with electricity. It was a statement. The future is electric, and we're living in it. The house had modern plumbing, 16 bathrooms with running water, hot and cold, central heating throughout, an elevator, still a rarity in private homes. And to keep all this running, 36 to 40 servants lived on site, full time. Cooks, housekeepers, maids, footmen, butlers, valets, ladies' maids, maintenance workers. Think about that for a moment. 40 people whose full-time job was maintaining one family's house. Their quarters were in the upper floors and basement, not quite as lavish as the main floors, obviously, but, by the standards of domestic service, quite good. The Vanderbilts were known as fair employers, but still, 40 people. That's not a house. That's an institution. A palace requires a court, and the servants were that court. After Cornelius's death in 1899, when Alice was living there alone with just the staff, newspapers started calling it a white elephant. This magnificent palace, mostly empty, with 40 servants maintaining rooms no one used anymore. Because that's the thing about building something this large. It takes on a life of its own. It demands to be maintained. The house becomes master. The owner becomes servant. Servant to the enormous, endless appetite of 137 rooms that need to be heated, cleaned, preserved. But in 1893, when it was new, when the family filled those rooms with life and laughter and society's elite, it must have seemed eternal, solid, permanent. A monument to the Vanderbilt name that would stand for centuries. 40 years. That's how long it stood. Picture a typical evening at 1 West 57th Street in the mid-1890s. Carriages begin arriving at dusk. pulling through the 58th Street porte cochere. Each one carries members of New York's absolute elite: the Astors, the Goulds, other Vanderbilts, European nobility visiting America, perhaps a Rockefeller or two. Visitors lucky enough to be on this spot, wrote Valentine's Manual of Old New York, will never forget the procession of smart equipages, discharging passengers, each of them a society member of high standing. Inside, Alice Vanderbilt presides. She's in her element here, the perfect society hostess. Her gown might be one of the famous ones, like the electric light bedecked dress she wore to a costume ball in 1883, covered in tiny light bulbs, powered by batteries in her bustle. The Vanderbilts didn't just embrace modernity, they wore it. Guests move through those magnificent rooms. Cocktails in the Louis XIV salon. Dinner for 60 in the formal dining room, surrounded by old master paintings. Music, perhaps a private performance by one of the era's great musicians, in the ballroom that can hold 1,000. This is the pinnacle. This is what the Gilded Age looked like at its peak. Not just wealth, but the performance of wealth. Every detail chosen to impress, to demonstrate that you have not just arrived, but that you define what arrival means. The Vanderbilt bulls became legendary. They would compete with other society families, sometimes friendly competition, sometimes less so, to host the most elaborate events. Themes, costumes, the best food, the finest wines, entertainment that would be talked about for months afterward. This wasn't just about pleasure. This was about power, social power. Who got invited to these events determined who mattered in New York society. And Alice Vanderbilt held those keys. But even in these glory days, there were signs of something impermanent. In 1899, Cornelius Vanderbilt II died unexpectedly. He was only 55 years old, relatively young even by 19th century standards. He'd suffered a stroke and never recovered. His death changed everything. In his will, Cornelius left Alice generous provisions: a $7 million trust fund that would yield about $250,000 per year. That sounds enormous, and it was. But here's the thing. It was earmarked specifically to maintain the two largest properties, the Fifth Avenue Mansion and the Breakers in Newport. The principal fortune, the tens of millions, went mostly to their children, especially the sons. Alice had life tenancy in the houses, but not the fortune to maintain them easily. And maintaining 1 West 57th Street was expensive, incredibly expensive. 40 servants, heating 6 stories through New York winters, property taxes on the most valuable residential land in America, constant maintenance on those elaborate European interiors. The house had been designed for a wealthy couple with a large family and active social life. Now it was mostly just Alice and the staff, living in 137 rooms. She continued hosting, continued her social obligations, but the house must have felt different, emptier, less justified. And the neighborhood was changing. Fifth Avenue in 1900 was still Millionaire's Row, but commerce was creeping north. Luxury shops were opening. Real estate developers were eyeing those large mansion lots and imagining office buildings, hotels, apartment towers. The land beneath the Vanderbilt Mansion was appreciating faster than the house itself, which meant an economic calculation was beginning to form.
one that would doom not just the Vanderbilt house, but every mansion on Fifth Avenue. The building was worth less than the land it sat on. And once that equation tips, once the land value exceeds the building value, no house survives.
By the 1920s, Fifth Avenue had transformed beyond recognition. The mansions that had defined the street for a generation were falling one by one. The Astor Mansion, demolished. The William A. Clark House, finished in 1907 for $6 million with 121 rooms, demolished in 1927, after just 15 years. Clark's Folly, they called it, because even by Gilded Age standards it was excessive. What replaced them? Department stores, office buildings, hotels. The commercial was consuming the residential. And the economics were inescapable. Property taxes had risen dramatically. Maintenance costs were soaring. Meanwhile, a mansion lot could sell for millions to developers who would build structures generating far more revenue than any single-family home. The city was rezoning Fifth Avenue for commercial use. Millionaires' Row was being legislated out of existence. For Alice Vanderbilt, now in her 70s, the situation was becoming untenable. Her $250,000 annual trust income, which would have been more than enough in 1900, was being eaten alive by inflation and rising costs. The mansion was becoming a burden. And there was something else, something harder to quantify. The world had moved on. The Gilded Age was over. The Roaring Twenties were here. The mansions that had symbolized success now looked dated, anachronistic, even tasteless to some. Wealthy New Yorkers were moving into elegant apartments on Park Avenue, or smaller townhouses uptown, or leaving the city entirely for suburbs. The fashion had shifted toward understated elegance, away from obvious opulence. A 137-room château in the middle of Manhattan. That didn't represent success anymore. It represented the embarrassing excesses of a previous generation. In August 1925, Alice Vanderbilt went to the New York Supreme Court with an unusual request. The Fifth Avenue mansion was held in trust. She couldn't simply sell it on her own authority. She needed court permission. And she was asking to sell for $7,100,000. $7 million for her house. To understand how extraordinary that number was, this was more than double what Cornelius had spent building the place. The court approved. By 1926, a deal was finalized with the Brasted Realty Corporation, a development syndicate led by real estate investor Frederick Brown. The sale price, approximately $7 million. Here's what everyone understood, even if no one said it directly. They weren't buying a house. They were buying land. The mansion itself, an obstacle, a thing to be removed. Alice had no hope for the house's preservation, wrote one contemporary account. The buyers paid for the land, not for the house that stood on it. It was the end of an era, documented in newspaper headlines. The largest private home in New York City, changing hands for a record sum, destined for destruction. But before the wrecking ball came, Alice did something remarkable. In January 1927, 1 week before demolition was scheduled to begin, Alice Vanderbilt opened her house to the public. Anyone could come. 50 cents admission, money donated to charity. And thousands came. They lined up on Fifth Avenue, these ordinary New Yorkers who'd walked past this fortress their entire lives, wondering what was inside. Now,
For $50 and 1 week only, they could see. They signed the Vanderbilt guest book. They walked through that 5-story entrance hall. They looked up at John Lafarge's stained glass dome. They stood in the ballroom where 1,000 society guests had once danced. The newspapers described curious public and long lines of visitors. This was a sensation, a farewell to Gilded Age splendor from people who knew they'd never see anything like it again. It was poignant, sad even. These rooms that had been designed to impress the wealthiest people in America, now filled with office workers and shopkeepers and school teachers, all paying their respects to something that represented a world they'd never been part of. By the end of the week, the massive doors closed for the last time. In spring 1927, the demolition crews arrived. The Vanderbilt Mansion was systematically dismantled through the spring and summer of 1927. Those turrets, those limestone walls, those 137 rooms, reduced to rubble over a period of months. By 1928, rising in its place was the flagship store of Bergdorf Goodman, an upscale department store. Elegant, modern, commercial. It's still there today. If you walk to 5th Avenue and 57th Street right now, you'll see Bergdorf Goodman. It's been there almost 100 years, far longer than the Vanderbilt Mansion that preceded it. But before the demolition, Alice saved what she could. That Augustus St. Gordon's fireplace, she donated it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it remains on display today. The wrought iron entry gates, she gave them to New York City. They now stand at the Conservatory Garden entrance in Central Park at 105 Street. 2 carved stone friezes from the facade, incorporated into the Sherry Netherland Hotel lobby on 5th Avenue, where they're still visible. The Moorish ceiling from the smoking room, eventually installed in the Landmark Theatre in Syracuse, New York. Various furnishings, art, chandeliers, some went to Alice's smaller home, some to the Breakers in Newport. Some were auctioned off. Some, apparently, were bought by Hollywood set designers for period films in the 1930s. The mansion is gone, but pieces survive, scattered across museums and buildings, fragments of a lost whole.
So, what does this story tell us? The obvious lesson is about impermanence. Even the grandest monuments to wealth can vanish. Cornelius Vanderbilt II spent $100 million in today's terms building a palace designed to last forever. It lasted 44 years. But the deeper lesson is about what we value. In the 1920s, remarkably, there was almost no public outcry over the demolition. No preservation movement to save it. No sense that something irreplaceable was being lost. Only later, decades later, did architectural historians recognize this as a tragedy. Only in hindsight did we realize what had been destroyed. Because in 1927, the mansion didn't represent beauty or architectural achievement. It represented the excesses of a discredited past. It represented inequality, robber barons, a Gilded Age that had literally been regulated out of existence by progressive reform. Modern New Yorkers wanted progress, commerce, democracy, not palaces to aristocratic pretensions. And there's something else worth noting. The Vanderbilt fortune itself didn't survive much longer than the mansion.
Despite being one of the wealthiest families in world history, by 1973, just 76 years after Cornelius II's death, 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at a family reunion, and not one was a millionaire. The fortune vanished faster than the house did. "Any fool can make a fortune," the Commodore supposedly said. "It takes a man of brains to hold on to it." Today, if you visit the Metropolitan Museum and see that St. Gordon's fireplace, or walk through those iron gates in Central Park, you're experiencing fragments of a lost world. Physical reminders that even stone and marble and millions of dollars can't create permanence. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built a palace. New York demolished it and built a department store. And both decisions, the building and the destroying, tell us something essential about American values. We admire ambition, but we're suspicious of excess. We respect achievement, but we don't believe in dynasties. We build monuments, but we're willing to tear them down when they no longer serve us. The Vanderbilt Mansion that mysteriously disappeared? It didn't disappear at all. It was deliberately destroyed, for reasons that made perfect sense at the time, by a society that had decided such things no longer mattered. Perhaps the real mystery isn't what happened to the mansion. Perhaps it's what this story reveals about us. What we build, what we destroy, and what we choose to remember. Thank you for watching.